Well, today is going to be a fascinating things hidden discussion. Normally, we look and investigate the work of René Girard, mimetic theory, and anthropology. But today we have an interesting kind of another perspective on similar processes that I think mimetic theory is looking at. We're joined by the esteemed Professor Mattias Desmet. He's recognized as the world's leading expert on the theory of mass formation as it applies to the COVID-19 pandemic. He's a professor of clinical psychology in the Department of Psychology and Educational Sciences at Ghent University in Belgium. He's a practicing psychoanalytic psychotherapist. His works have been displayed widely in the media, including the Joe Rogan Experience, Forbes, New York Post, Fox News, Salon. So he covers left and right in interest. His previous books include The Pursuit of Objectivity in Psychology and Lacan's Logic of Subjectivity, A Walk on the Graph of Desire. Thank you for joining me, Professor Desmond.
Thank you for inviting me, David.
Yes.
I'm happy to be here.
Now, I'm having you on because, of course, I have been following a lot of the voices who have been critical of the groupthink surrounding the pandemic response, the policies put forth by public health institutions, largely led by America's public health leaders and officials, because they set the stage for so much of the world policy for good and bad. And of course, Dr. Malone really put your concept into the pop culture. Everybody was talking about it with Joe Rogan, with one of the most highly downloaded podcasts of all time, this idea of mass formation, which got Twitter really wanting to tamp down on that term there. So first of all, how did you get into this topic? And second, did you like the way the idea was introduced to the masses, or did you say, oh, no, this is not the way I wanted it to be understood?
Well, of course, I was very happy that Dr. Malone brought my work under the attention of a very wide audience. And he did so in an amazing way. He actually was one of the few who succeeded in summarizing my theory on mass formation in a more or less accurate way. So that was great, of course. The only thing I personally never used the term mass formation psychosis. So I always talked about mass formation, just because I think that adding the term psychosis to it more or less is maybe a little bit less accurate from an intellectual, but also from an ethical and a pragmatic point of view. I don't think I have to go into detail about that, but usually I just prefer the term mass formation because it's a more neutral term, maybe a less stigmatizing term. So I usually prefer the term mass formation, but Dr. Malone did a wonderful job summarizing my theory and bringing it to the attention indeed of not only the Americans, but also a major part of the world, I think. So
Right. Well, it certainly has captured the attention of so many people who are wanting to understand, why is it that people hold on to rituals and behaviors even when, all logic and reason seems to suggest they need to abandon such behavior sets. People stubbornly hold on to beliefs, like wearing a mask, if it's, science comes out and says may not be quite as efficacious, turning around airplanes when a 2-year-old with autism has a hard time keeping a mask over his mouth. The airline had to turn the plane around to go home for that 2-year-old because he couldn't keep the mask on. What causes these kind of mass irrational behavior sets that seem to be so comfortable and so a part of people's identity?
Yes, no matter how absurd they seem, such behaviors, you can perfectly understand them. That's what I try to explain with my theory of mass formation. So first and for all, you have to understand what happens psychologically if a mass emerges in a society. A mass, a crowd, one could say, is a very specific kind of group which emerges under very specific conditions. And these conditions are really crucial to understand. The first thing that has to happen is the first condition is that many people have to feel socially isolated. So they have to feel socially isolated, disconnected from their natural and social environment, which was definitely the case just before the corona crisis, because just before the corona crisis, somewhere in between 30 and 50% of the people worldwide mentioned that they did not have one meaningful contact and that they only connected to other people through the internet, which is actually the same as not connecting at all, because at the human level, it's definitely not the same. You can exchange information through the internet in an extremely efficient way, but the connection, the human connection between two people is not the same through the internet. It's not at all. Not at all the same. In one way or another, online connections are rather exhausting. If you try to gather through the internet, you can definitely experience that. So first and for all, many people have to feel socially isolated, have to experience a lack of resonance with other people and with their natural environment. That's crucial.
What do you mean by a lack of resonance with other people in their environment?
Just that they lack the empathic connection that usually exists if two people meet in the real world. If two people meet in the real world, their bodies, for instance, will resonate with each other. The tension in the muscles will resonate. If you look at someone's face when you're talking to someone in the real world, the tension in the muscles on your face will be similar to the tension in the muscles of the person you're talking to.
Have you looked into mirror neurons and the connection there with this?
Oh yes. I know the theory about the mirror neurons very well, and also several other.
Is that connected to what you're referring to here when you talk about resonance with humans?
Yes, that's exactly what I described. That's the neurological theory about the phenomenon that I described, the resonance between people. So if that stops, if that drops away, if people stop resonating with each other, they start to feel socially isolated more and more. And that leads to the second condition, which is crucial for mass formation, that people have to experience a lack of meaning making. And also that was definitely the case just before the corona crisis. Just before the corona crisis, somewhere in between 30 and 60% of the people worldwide mentioned that they considered their job, for instance, a bullshit job. That means that they didn't know what their job was good for. Between 30 and 60%, only 15% of the people mentioned that they thought their job was meaningful. So that's extreme. It shows how many people were suffering from or were struggling with experiences of lack of meaning making.
Yeah, alienation, right? Alienation from the productivity of their work, right?
Yes, and the second, the lack of meaning making actually follows logically from the feeling of disconnection, because people feel a spontaneous sense of meaning in their lives when they see that they have an effect on someone else, when they see that they mean something to someone else, when they see that they can make other people happy, or at least that they have one or another effect whatsoever. So if people start to feel socially disconnected, then they automatically, or to a certain extent automatically, also suffer from experiences of meaninglessness, often without knowing why exactly they deal with these experiences. So that are two crucial conditions. People have to be socially isolated, and they have to feel a lack of meaning making. And then the third condition is extremely important. When people feel socially disconnected, they will typically start to struggle with what I call, and what many psychologists call, free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression. So free-floating negative affects. That's extremely important. Free-floating negative affects, that means that people will deal with anxiety, frustration, and aggression, and that they will not know what they feel anxious, frustrated, and aggressive for. So that means that their anxiety, frustration, and aggression is without a mental representation. It floats freely in their psychological space. If these conditions are met, if a large part of the population is in this state, socially isolated, lack of meaning making, a lot of free floating negative effects such as anxiety, frustration, and aggression, something very specific might happen. If under these conditions, a narrative is distributed through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety and a strategy to deal with this object of anxiety, then all this free-floating anxiety might connect to the object of anxiety. And there might be a large willingness in society to follow the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, no matter how absurd this strategy is. And the reason is simple. At the mental level, free-floating anxiety is extremely aversive because you cannot control it. If you don't know what you're anxious for, you don't know how you can protect yourself from your anxiety. It's extremely negative. It's one of the most painful mental states someone can be in. And so if people can connect their anxiety to this object of anxiety, for instance, the coronavirus, but it could also be the Jews in Nazi Germany, or the aristocracy in the Soviet Union, or the Ancien Regime in the French Revolution, or the witches during the witch hunts, and so on. And every phenomenon of mass formation, you see the same mechanisms. Always this population first is in a specific mental state, suffers from these four conditions, which I just described, or these conditions I just described, and then a narrative is distributed, indicating an object of anxiety and the strategy to deal with that object of anxiety. And what you see is that people start to connect their anxiety to this object and are willing to participate in the strategy. And then, in a second step, something even more important happens. In a second step, because many people participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, the war on terror, or the war on the coronavirus, doesn't matter, because many people participate in the strategy at the same time, a new social bond emerges, and that's the mass or the crowd. But the social bond has a very specific nature. It's not a social bond. It's not a bond between individuals. It's always the mass or the crowd is a group that is formed because all individuals separately connect to the group identity. So this new enthusiastic, fanatic solidarity that always emerges in a mass is always a solidarity of the individual with the collective. And the social bonds between the individuals typically deteriorates more and more the longer the mass exists. And in the end, that's the reason why in totalitarian states, all social bonds between individuals are destroyed. And the totalitarian state, which is always based on mass formation, that's the difference with the classical dictatorship. The classical dictatorship is not based on mass formation. A totalitarian state is based on mass formation. That's the reason why all totalitarian states end up in a typically, absolutely paranoid atmosphere in which everybody is prepared to destroy its neighbor. When he thinks that his neighbor doesn't show enough loyalty to the collective, to the state. So that's about how mass emerges.
It's almost a parasitical psychological state, right? Where they get taken over, possessed by a crowd spirit, and any neighbor that does not signal proper solidarity with that crowd spirit is kind of an agitation to that state of mind, right? That possession.
That's what happens.
It's kind of is it kind of like a suspension of disbelief when you watch a movie and you become transfixed with the characters, and then someone turns on the lights in the middle of the movie theater and it disrupts your suspension of disbelief. Your fantasy is kind of ruined when your neighbor is not showing proper solidarity with the ritual, right?
Yes, something like that. Yes, something like that. And the mechanism is actually identical, and really identical, to hypnosis. So what happens under hypnosis is the following. Under hypnosis, there is someone, a hypnotist, who has a natural skill, a natural talent to withdraw the attention of someone from the environment, and then through a hypnotic suggestion, focus it all on one point. For instance, a pendulum that is moving, or the voice of the hypnotist. And once the attention, all the psychological energy of the person that is hypnotized is focused on this one point, this mechanism of the focusing of attention is extremely strong. You can perfectly perform a surgical operation under hypnosis. A surgical operation, I've seen it, it happens hundreds of times here in a university hospital here in Belgium, hundreds of times a year. And once the attention of someone is focused on one small point of reality, you can perfectly cut through the skin, the bones, even cut straight through the breastbone. The person won't notice it. And that's the explanation why you can take everything away of someone who is in mass formation or in hypnosis. He won't notice it. Once the attention is focused on the coronavirus and on the measures, people won't notice that they lose everything, their health, their wealth, the future of their children, the health of their children, doesn't matter. They won't notice it. And no matter how long you try to show to someone in mass formation that what he believes in is absurd and that it doesn't take into account a major part of reality, such as all the victims claimed by the corona measures itself, which were probably much more numerous than the victims that could be claimed by the coronavirus. People won't notice this. Once they are in mass formation, they just don't notice it. They don't notice it because their attention is connected to this one small part of reality. And that explains why rational counter-argumentation just doesn't work. That has been described by people studying mass formation from the beginning of the 19th century onwards, such as Gustave Le Bon, for instance. He described already that once mass formation emerges, it's almost impossible to wake people up who are in it. But if people who are not in the process of mass formation, and that's extremely important, that's the most important message I can bring today, I think. If people who are not into mass formation continue to speak out, they won't be able to wake up the masses or the people in a mass formation, but their voice will prevent that the mass formation goes deeper and deeper, and that the mass formation reaches a depth where people in the mass become convinced that it is their ethical duty to destroy everyone who does not go along with the masses. That's so important. It's the most crucial message I can bring, because every mass or every crowd, if it is a real mass or crowd, shows the tendency to go deeper and deeper into the hypnosis and to start to destroy everyone who does not belong to the mass or who refuses to go along with the narrative that led to the mass formation. That's what typically happened in every mass, during the Crusades, during the witch hunts, during the Bartholomeus Night, during the French Revolution, during Nazi and Stalinism. You see always the same. The masses always tend to consider the people who do not want to go along with them as non-human. They are considered as people who lack every kind of solidarity, who show no citizenship, who are not human, and consequently should be destroyed. Well, that point can be prevented, or that aspect of mass formation can be prevented if the people who do not go along with the masses continue to speak out. And they usually, once a mass formation emerges in a society, it typically shows a very strong intolerance for dissonant voices. That's what typically happens in a mass, because the masses don't want to wake up. They absolutely don't want to wake up, because if they wake up, they would be confronted again with the loneliness, the lack of meaning making, the free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression. So they don't want to wake up, because the mass formation leads to this new pseudo symptomatic social bond, and it leads to this mental control over the anxiety. It also always promises that all frustration and aggression might be directed in the future, might be satisfied by directing it at an object, at the object of anxiety, It also provides a new kind of meaning making in life. The heroic struggle with the object of anxiety, the crusades, or no matter what, it provides a new kind of meaning making. And that's all these psychological symptomatic advances make that people don't want to wake up. They don't want to wake up. And the leaders of the mass also don't want the masses to wake up, just because they know that if the masses wake up, they will see all the damage that was caused when they were in the mass formation.
Are the leaders suspect to? Are the leaders enthralled by this mass formation as well, or do you believe in your theory that they are knowingly creating this and they're not affected by the spell as the people in it are?
No. The public leaders of the masses, the people who go on stage and who pronounce the narrative that leads to the mass formation, are hypnotized themselves, almost always. They are hypnotized not so much by the narrative that they pronounce, but they are hypnotized by their ideology. For instance, the Nazi leaders who believed in their race theories and their ideologies fanatically, just like the communist leaders and Stalin believed in historical materialism as an ideology. But very often the leaders don't believe the narratives they use to promote the ideology. They use the narrative to manipulate, cheat, lie, to try to convince people to obey and to accept that society is reshaped according to the ideology they believe in. So like in our times now, in the corona crisis, I believe that the ideology is something like technocracy or transhumanism. That's the ideology. And in the corona narrative or the climate narrative or no matter what narrative, the war on terror and so, are typically narratives that are used to try to force people or to try to make people consent.
So the ideology is the religion, and then the narratives are the myths that religions tell their people to kind of explain why the world is the way it is, right?
You might consider it like that a little bit, yes. I think it could be compared to an institutionalized religious ideology indeed. I think the totalitarian ideologies are very often even worse than the religious, than the institutionalized religious dogmatic ideologies. But anyway, you could compare it a little bit with that, yes. So
religion, and I'm using the word religion in the Latin sense, the Latin root being to bind together. What binds the community together? What gives it? And yes, the traditional society, there wasn't a distinction between culture and religion. It was almost synonymous, right? So I'm not using that to isolate particular religions for particular scorn, but rather just in the traditional sense of society and culture being synonymous with religious structure, right? And
that's right.
Now we try to parse these things separately and say, well, there's ideology, which is different, but it's really just modern forms of the same binding agents, right? And then and then these narratives that we talk about are just, I guess what I'm just mapping this out in the history, that the narratives that the media gives us are kind of like the myths of the ancient community, right? Where you'd say we have to sacrifice this virgin girl to God, because if we don't, the famine will continue or the plague will destroy us all.
Yeah, it's actually the ideologies or the underlying symbolic structures, I think, in the sense that Claude Lévi-Strauss, for instance, interprets the idea of a symbolic structure. Yes, but that's right. And so like the leaders of the masses, and I always talk about the public leaders of the masses, the people who in the public space pronounce the hypnotizing narrative or the narrative that leads to the mass formation. They usually are under hypnosis themselves, absolutely. And they show all the same characteristics. They also show the same radical willingness to sacrifice themselves. If you look at what happened in during the Moscow purges, the trials in Moscow, or under the communist regime, and you see very clearly that the leaders of the Communist Party, they were the one after the other was liquidated, tortured, and killed by Stalin, and in a very typical way. They even did not object. They said things like, "Well, okay, if this is what I can do for the Communist Party, then I'm prepared to do it." It was a very strange phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
They were charged of a betrayal or something like that, and usually they didn't have done anything wrong, or they didn't do something that went against Stalin's orders, and still. If they received the death penalty, they even didn't object. They just accepted it and said, like, well, yes, if that's what they can do for the Communist Party, then I'm willing to do so. That's typical.
Who or what hypnotizes the public officials?
Their ideology. That's what.
Who gives it to them? Other officials before them, or like who passes it on? You know, who hypnotizes
I don't think so.
them?
I think it's the ideology itself. At least, for instance, that's what people such as Gustave Le Bon said. Both the masses and their leaders are hypnotized in the first place by the ideology itself. Of course, the leaders of the masses, the public leaders of the masses, might be manipulated for certain reasons themselves. There are certain big financial players who will try to manipulate them and so on, and very often they succeed in doing so. But I don't think that someone hypnotizes them. They are just hypnotized by their own ideas and also by the masses themselves. There is like a circular, reciprocal hypnosis, I think, between the masses and the leaders.
They almost become possessed by the crowd themselves as a conduit, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I think so.
Similar to, like, you look at a rock star performing on stage and they say they feel like they become possessed by the energy that the crowd adores them and gives them all this special attention and adulation, right? And then when they get off stage, they feel drained, like they've come down from the biggest high they could ever have, right? I guess it's a similar experience to that. What is the psychological process of that, in your opinion, as a psychologist? What's going on there that gives someone such a high to get so much attention and focus from a crowd like that? You know,
it's the vibrating resonance of the voice that hypnotizes someone. The masses are hypnotized by the leader, but also by the rest of the masses. They are well, in one way or another, they are in the grip of this resonating voice.
When you say resonance, you're not really meaning that as a metaphor, are you? You're meaning something kind of literal, right?
I mean it quite literal, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And that holds for the leaders of the masses, and it holds for the masses itself, I think. It's so, of course, it's something strange, because sometimes, and very often, masses don't have to meet physically to emerge. There are masses who emerge in a physical way. For instance, in a football stadium, when supporters all sing the same song together, you have typically a mass formation in which there is a physical resonance of the voice. But in one way or another, like many masses emerge without ever having met.
Like Twitter mobs, right?
Twitter mob, yes, of course, yes. So it's as if there is a mental equivalent of the physical resonance that also does the job. Yeah.
Have you talked to any biophysicists or anybody to try to understand what's going on that side of it?
No.
That needs to be further researched on the physics of what's going on.
Yes.
There.
Yes.
Very fascinating stuff. So is there a distinction between mass formation and mania, and like tulip mania, or fads or hysterias? Are those all just the same thing, or they to different degrees?
They are not identical. There are many different types of mass formation. Mass hysteria is one of them. For instance, the dancing plague in Strasbourg in 1582, I think, was an example of a mass hysteria. I think that what is typical for a mass hysteria is that there doesn't need to be an object of anxiety in such a case. And that the psychological, the crucial psychological factor in a mass hysteria, I think, is this feeling of new connection, and not so much it's not so much an attempt to control freely floating anxiety, I think. So there are many different kinds of mass formation, and I think it's important to distinguish between them. But I think that the most dangerous are definitely the mass formations, in which the mass is formed when there is a lot of free floating anxiety, a lot of frustration and aggression, and in which the formation of the mass has the function of channeling all this frustration and aggression, and also of controlling all this anxiety. That's definitely the most dangerous kind of mass formation, which was the kind of mass formation that led to the French Revolution, and also to the emergence of communism and Stalin and Nazism and Nazi Germany. So,
do you explore the idea of the psychological feeling of catharsis that takes place when you unload that anger or aggression onto the common victim by killing them or purging them from the community?
No, it will not.
You don't think it works? You don't think it creates catharsis?
No, it doesn't create catharsis. To the contrary.
Well, let me give you an example of what I mean. Like in the American South and America abroad, during the racial tensions where there was a lot of lynchings, you would have a crowd would form, and they would single out an African American, someone who was targeted for accusation, oh, you did this, you did that. And they would lynch them, and then there would be like a catharsis. They'd have a party and everything's relaxed. Everybody's happy because they murdered their victim.
Yes,
is there any kind of exploration of that phenomenon as part of the mass formation? They don't keep them, they don't keep the target going. They have a momentary resolution.
Yes, no, but usually, for instance, large-scale mass formation leads in a vicious circle. It makes that's so dramatic about mass formation. You can explain it in many different ways. Someone like George Orwell understood that extremely well. If you read Animal Farm, for instance, he describes it very well, and also in his 1984 novel. The problem with mass formation is that there might be a very short catharsis, draining the frustration and aggression after the formation of a lynch mob, for instance. But the problem is that very soon there is even more frustration and aggression, and very soon there is even more anxiety, and very soon, and that's so dramatic about mass formation. So
why?
Well, because
why does it lead to even more aggression? Like you get relief, but then there's more aggression afterward. What's causing the more part to rise up?
Well, that's very simple. It's because the most crucial precondition for mass formation, the social isolation, gets stronger and stronger and stronger throughout the mass formation. That's the problem. So, and for instance, it's very interesting to see what happened after the Corona crisis. After the Corona crisis in Europe, we immediately, after the Corona crisis didn't stop, but the Corona narrative became a little bit less dominant in the public space somewhere in March, I believe. And immediately there was a new narrative, the narrative on the war with Ukraine, which had exactly the same function. And that's the dramatic about mass formation. The real core problem, the most crucial problem that exists just before the mass formation is this social isolation, this lack of connectedness. And then when the mass emerges, people feel connected again, but it's a symptomatic connection, because it's not a connection between individuals. As I just said, the connection between individuals even deteriorates. The feeling of connection that exists is a connection between the individual and the collective. And that makes that throughout the process of mass formation, the social disconnection between the individuals gets stronger and stronger and stronger until society arrives in a radical paranoid atmosphere. That's what I explained. So that means that mass formation creates the problem that it tries to solve. And that's why mass formation typically gets worse, creates more and more and more anxiety, and creates more and more and more frustration and aggression, and becomes increasingly self-destructive until, as Hannah Arendt writes in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, until the totalitarian state and the mass becomes a monster that devours its own children. Always. That's the only cynical advantage of totalitarianism and mass formation, that in the end, it always destroys itself. And before it destroys itself, so
what causes it to destroy itself? The growing isolation of the members because of their solidarity.
And the growing frustration and aggression. So
kind of like cults, where you see cults, they form, they break away from society, and they have ever stricter rules, ever arduous rituals, and people become competitive to keep up with those rituals and kind of antisocial habits. And there's friction between the community until it kind of starts devouring members in competition for holiness, right? You know, they're trying to keep up with kind of a purity codes and so forth.
Yeah. Yes, for instance, but you can see it, you can understand it very, very easily, I think, if you know that. So, once the mass emerges, the mass doesn't want to wake up, and the leaders of the mass realize also they also don't want to wake up, and they realize that if the masses would wake up, they would be killed. So that means that the mass formation has to continue to exist. That means that it always has to put forward, to indicate an object of anxiety. George Orwell describes this very well. The totalitarian state in 1984 always needs something that people are scared of. So the masses always need an object of anxiety. This object of anxiety, time and time again, has to be destroyed. And in the end, the masses have no other option than to start to divorce some of their own members. And that's what they do. So the process of mass formation never went further than in communism under Stalin. And what we noticed there, or what history shows there, is just mind-boggling. So Stalin first started to isolate and destroy the aristocracy, then the large farmers, then the small farmers, then the goldsmiths, then the Jews. That all was still a little bit understandable or logic, because all these social groups would never be good communists, because they were all too much attached to their private property. So you could make sense of it within the narrative of the Soviet Union. But then, after these groups, Stalin just started to eliminate and to liquidate the one group after the other. And in the end, nobody knew anymore why a certain group had to be eliminated, but they all did it without objecting. They all accepted that the one group after the other was put to the gulags and destroyed. Between 1935 and 1938, I think, Alexander Solzhenitsyn estimates that about 80 million people were destroyed in the gulags while nobody knew what the hell they would have done wrong, these people. But they just, in one way or another, society always needed new objects of anxiety. And as soon as you understand the mechanisms of mass formation, you understand why processes like that happened. In Nazi Germany, this didn't happen, but it was only because the war destroyed Nazi Germany before the process of mass formation and the totalitarian trends could go as far as in the Soviet Union.
So first, a mass formation forms on an object of fascination and scandal that is kind of like an enemy other. And then in order to maintain its unity in against that object of scandal, it has to kind of feed the beast by sacrificing members of its own body, right? It's like stoking the flames. You got to keep feeding the beast, right? Exactly. So it's there's like a big scapegoat, enemy other, and then there's these little scapegoats that you feed within the community to kind of keep the fire going of that unanimous difference between the other and the people who are in the mass, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what happens. It's a very nice metaphor. Yeah, exactly. And the first steps of the mass formation might be different. For instance, in the Soviet Union, there was first a communist elite which created a mass formation artificially through first small scale, then large scale indoctrination and propaganda. And in Nazi Germany, it went the other way around. There was first the emergence of a mass spontaneously, and then from the mass, very slowly, leaders emerged, which took the lead, and with the help of the mass, took control over the state system. But then Hannah Arendt says, in both cases, the effect is the same. It's always a diabolic pact between the mass and its leaders that takes control over society, and that starts this diabolic process in which, indeed, in the end, the totalitarian states devours its own children. That's well.
And diabolic is, similar to, Rene Girard calls it satanic. The crowd is he believes that in the gospel stories that the term Satan is not meant to be a being, but rather the spirit of the crowd that creates order out of disorder. Chaos ensues, which is kind of what you're talking about, that state of free-floating anxiety and
yes, definitely,
and antisocial behavior. And then it's congealed by sacrifice against a common object of fascination. And
exactly,
he says it's both attraction and repulsion, kind of like a scandal that, you're simultaneously repulsed, but you're also attracted to your object. And I think there might be something there with a parallel to what you're describing there.
Yeah, might be. And in any case, it's a process that is perfectly comparable to the emergence of a complex dynamical system. For instance, the emergence of turbulence in water or gas. It's exactly the same. And indeed, and Hannah Arendt also calls it the ultimate evil. She says it's the ultimate evil. It's mass formation and totalitarianism are the ultimate evil because they always threaten to destroy the core of humanity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when in the story of in the gospel story about Jesus confronting the woman accused of adultery, you have a kind of mini mass formation take place where you have this crowd is determined to murder this woman who is their object that binds them together. And Jesus comes in there and he kind of does what I call social aikido to destroy the mass formation. Instead of looking at them in the eyes, that resonance you were talking about, he averts his gaze. So he doesn't look down and he doesn't make eye contact to get in conflict with them. He averts his eyes. He starts doodling in the sand. And then he says, he who is without sin cast the first stone, which creates a question in the minds of the members of the mass formation, which is, well, who is it going to be? Is it me or you or him? Because you automatically are taking responsibility for the stone in your hand because you think, well, who's going to be the first one? Who's without sin here? It automatically brings you back to your individual mind rather than the hive mind. And so, and then the text says that the eldest men threw down their stones first. So they were the leaders, they were the role models. So they threw down their stones and the younger men followed. And so instead of them instead of them following each other into murdering their object of fascination, he gets them to do the opposite, where they follow each other and letting go of their desire to murder. So how do we create that kind of social aikido in our individual environment and in society to stop that kind of mass formation?
Yeah, through speech, we all have to. First, I want to tell something. You know that in the Bible distinguishes already between the people and the masses. Yeah, very strange.
Can you extrapolate that a little bit? Can you expand on that?
Well, I yes, because there is a difference, of course. In a mass becomes cruel. In a mass, all the individuals merge to a group, and group identity takes over individual identity, and so on. So, in contrast with just a collection of individuals who still continue to exist as separate individuals with a separate ethical awareness and a separate conscience. So that's exactly, it's a very important distinction. But as to what we can do about it, this social aikido, as you call it very eloquently, well, I think that we have to practice every day the art of speech. We have to learn to speak out in public space, not trying to convince people, but because that's very often counterproductive. But just claiming our right to speak out and to say what we think is true and sincere. I think you have to practice that. That's truly an art. It's truly an art to speak out in such a way. That's what you have to practice. That's what in the end what can keep open a path for the people who don't want to go along with the masses and who don't want to go along with the new ideology, the new transhumanism, the new technocracy. I think that's the most important thing we can do. And in the same way, while we do so, we will be experiencing a higher level of humanity ourselves. We will be pushed to higher levels of consciousness and of existence, of existing as a human being, I think. Because while we try to speak out in such a way, we will, yeah.
That's why he does. But to go to your point, to illustrate your point, Jesus doesn't try to persuade them to stop killing the woman. He doesn't say, you cannot kill her. She has every right. You don't have enough evidence. That's persuasion. What he says is he basically agrees, but allows it to fall on its own weight, because he says, well, whoever's sinless cast the first stone. So he's saying, I'm joining you in solidarity, but in a way that breaks your hive mind, right? So he's not persuading them.
It was absolutely a brilliant intervention. Yeah. Now I think about it. Yes, yeah. It was brilliant. Yes.
So how do we, I guess I want to go back to your first stage, which was free floating anxiety and antisocial atmosphere. You say that's the first condition that needs to happen, right? For a mass to form, right?
The most central condition is definitely the social isolation, or as Hannah Arendt calls it, the social atomization. So people have to feel atomized. That's the most central condition. All the rest follows from that, I think. So how
do we stop that part from happening?
Oh, that's very much connected to the level of industrialization and technology use. That's very clear. Throughout the last few hundred centuries, that's exactly what I describe in my book, the book that is about to be published in English now, the Psychology of Totalitarianism.
Right.
That's what I describe, that the mass formation exists as long as mankind exists, but throughout the last few hundred years, starting from the end of the 17th century onwards, I think, mass formation became increasingly strong, and the masses became larger, they lasted longer, and so on. So mass formation became increasingly strong until, in the beginning of the 20th century, the masses became so strong and the mass formation lasted so long that the masses, with the help of their leaders, took over the control over the state, and that a completely new kind of state emerged, which we know as the totalitarian state. So, and the reason why, that's one of the central questions that I answer in my book, in particular in the first part of the book, the reason why the masses became increasingly strong throughout the last centuries was the rise of mechanistic thinking in society. So the mechanistic view on man and the world, which means that in such a view on man and the world, the universe is compared to a materialist system, a system of molecules and atoms which interact with each other according to the laws of mechanics, and which can be entirely understood in a rational way. So that's the mechanistic view of man in the world. It's that view on man in the world, that ideology that led to an excessive industrialization and technology use. And it's industrialization and technology use. I give a list of examples in my book that leads to this lack of resonance of people with their environment. That's so typical. It's even the use of a simple a clock makes you less connected to your environment. So and that of course that's even much more true for.
But you wouldn't suggest, I guess, that obviously there were mass formations in the archaic world, right, before the rise of modern technology.
There were, yes, definitely.
So that suggests that it's not technology that's really causing it. Maybe technology is making it bigger and more powerful, right?
It's making it bigger and more powerful. That's exactly what you see. It's definitely the origin of mass formation is just disturbed social relationships, anxiety, free-floating anxiety, and so on. But that also existed before the use of technology, and but technology and industrialization just made it worse. That's what.
So do we need to create technology and stories that alleviate that anxiety to stop mass formation from taking place in the first place? It's like a preventative before you even get to the disease. Like, how do we prevent this? If our communities and our nations are like bodies, instead of waiting to the mass formation disease happens and then trying to stop it from spreading like a cancer, how do we prevent it from forming in the first place by alleviating that free flow? It's very interesting. It is very similar to cancer in the sense of cancer is usually typically in a body that's in a constant chronic inflammatory state. And inflammation is kind of like a bodily version of that free-floating anxiety that you were talking about, heat and friction, So you've got this going on. How do we prevent this tumor, this mass formation from taking place in the future so that people don't turn to that hypnosis?
Yes, the ultimate cause of totalitarianism and mass formation is this mechanistic ideology, this materialist ideology, which believes that the universe can be explained, controlled, and manipulated in an entirely rational way. So it's like a kind of hubris in which we think that our human mind can really understand everything, can know the world profoundly, and that we can use rational analysis to control, manipulate society. That's what technocracy and transhumanism is all about, actually. So that's the ultimate cause of mass formation and the large-scale mass formation of modern times and totalitarianism. So in the end, what we need is we have to get beyond this mechanistic thinking, and all the major scientists, the seminal scientists such as Niels Bohr, Schrödinger, Janos Bolyai, in more recent times, Lorenz and Mandelbrot and who could I mention as well? There were so many. They all started from this materialist, mechanist view on man and the world, but they all left it behind them because they all concluded that our rational, that rational analysis could understand only a very limited part of reality, and that for the rest, they said, that's very interesting, the rest of reality can only be known by empathically resonating with it. Extremely interesting. I'm forgetting the name of the guy who said this literally. It was the mathematician who was one of the founders of systems theory. Complex dynamical systems theory. Why do you understand? Forget his name now. I mentioned him in my book. So this guy said, René Thom, that's his name, René Thom. He said, there is only a very limited part of reality that we can understand in a rational way. And the rest of reality, we can only know by empathically connecting with it. And he said, great scientists did not distinguish from ordinary people because they had an extremely big capacity to think logically or to rationally understand. No, they distinguished from other people because they had a huge capacity to resonate with the phenomena they investigated. So that's so interesting. And once you start to understand and to accept that your rational understanding of the world is limited, then you see that the things around you, nature, other people, will always be a mystery to you, and that you can only connect to them and only know them for a moment by resonating with them, by empathically connecting to them. And I think at that moment, that's where, if you practice that, and the more you're open to this kind of knowing, the closer you are to a mystical experience, I think. Mm-hmm. That's what happened. You're liberated from the cage of your mind. And for me, I started to accept that my rational understanding was limited by following the path of science and by becoming familiar, for instance, with complex dynamical systems theory, which shows in a paradoxical way, in a strictly rational way, that reality is strictly irrational, irrational. So that's, as soon as you accept that, you can start to open up really to the world around you, to resonate with it.
It's so ironic how, belief in rationalism leads to you joining irrational crowds, It's so funny. Yeah. And it reminds me of the biblical saying about all we like sheep have gone astray, because it's your rationality that thinks that you're making your choices for you, and really you're being hooked in by the herd of sheep around you, but you don't know that, which is
exactly.
Is it possible then to empathically resonate with someone who's a member of mass formation and pull them out with your empathy and love?
To a certain extent.
Because obviously people have let go of some of these groupthink rituals through this pandemic. Some people have, some people have said, I'll give you an example. Jimmy Dore, the comedian, he really bought into the hysteria about coronavirus. He had to drive from California to New York, and he's a stand-up comedian. He's a Democrat, typically is going to be more inclined to go along with public health officials. So he really bought the propaganda that this COVID-19 was a terrible, terrible, dangerous disease for him. And he wouldn't go into bathrooms or anything. He just he had a bathroom in his camper or whatever. So but then eventually he realized when he got injured from the vaccine, he said, wait a second, this isn't exactly, they didn't tell me, and there's no recourse, there's no liability for the manufacturers of the product. And so now he's speaking out against it. So obviously people can be involved to some degree with the mass formation, but get off of the ride at some point when it becomes too unbelievable,
Some do.
Kind of like jumping the shark, the saying jumping the shark, when the show has gotten so ridiculous after season 10 that you say, I'm out of this show, I don't like it anymore. That's isn't that kind of what happens with mass formation? People start to get off ramps, like, okay, I think I've had enough. I did the shot. Now you tell me I need 6 boosters, now a 7 boost, all right, I'm off on the 6 booster. I'm off the ramp. I'm getting off the road on this one,
Usually about 30% of the people go all the way. That means until they are dead. And they don't wake up. They are willing to sacrifice their lives and everything that is important to them if it can prevent them from waking up. So it depends. There is usually about 30% of the people, of the population, who is in deep hypnosis and who is really hypnotized. And then about 50, 60, 65%, it depends a little bit, goes along with the narrative, but knows that there is something wrong with it, and that these people often switch their opinions.
They can be persuaded then, right?
Yes, but usually the problem with these people is that they just never go against the loudest voice in society. That's the problem. So and there is only a smaller percentage, 5, maybe 10%, that knows that the narrative is wrong and that also tries to speak out or tries to do something against it. Yeah.
Is it possible to create a counter mass formation which is equally toxic? You know what I mean? Like we put 3 masks on, but we hate people with masks. Now you've created a mass formation around hating people with masks. Does that also happen? Like a
Yes.
double mass formation?
Yes, that happens from time to time, but that's not a good idea, because if the group who doesn't go along with the narrative also forms a mass, then usually it is destroyed, because masses function. Then you just have a large group and a small group who function according to the same destructive principle, and the minor group is usually destroyed. But what it is all about is that the people who do not go along with the mass formation, they have to form a group, in a real group, which means a group that is composed of people who are connected as individuals between each other. So that's the way to, and as soon as this succeeds, as soon as the people who do not go along with the mass formation can really form a group, but a real group, not a mass. So a group based on connections between individuals and not on connections of each individual separately with the collective, then usually they can break the spell of the mass. That are 2 guiding principles, I think, in the first place.
And empathy, right? Yeah.
Can you come again, David? I didn't.
And empathy, right?
And empathy, of course, yes. Totalitarianism and mass formation dehumanizes the people who do not belong to the mass, and the people who do not belong with the mass should not react in the same way. They have to react in the opposite way. They have to continue to consider the people who are in the mass formation as separate human beings and individuals, and talk to them like that. That's also a very important.
Are the members of a mass formation victims of abuse because of the abusive nature of the formation experience? Or do you think they should be considered responsible for their
participation? They are responsible. Of course, they are responsible. That's Sigmund Freud gave us a very nice quote about that. He said, "We are all responsible for our unconscious," he said. But that's what we are. It's not because you do something unconsciously that you're not responsible for it. It's not because you're hypnotized that you're not responsible for what you do. And exactly, hypnosis also shows this very clearly. It shows that under hypnosis, you can make someone do something that he is very ashamed of, or that he is not capable to in a physical way when he's not hypnotized, but you cannot make him cross ethical boundaries that he wouldn't cross when he's not hypnotized. So what we reveal when we are hypnotized, or when we are in a process of mass formation, is our real ethical level. That's what we reveal. And that, consequently, we are also responsible for what we do when we are in a mass formation.
So would you say, in closing, that the coronavirus mass formation is over and has been dissolved into the Ukraine mass formation, or are there parallel Venn diagrams where they're overlapping and the coronavirus mass formation is still taking place, but it's not as strong and it has been supplanted by the more attractive Ukraine war mass formation?
I think it are communicating barrels to a certain extent. While the one mass formation becomes stronger, the other will diminish a little bit. But they will alternate, I think. I believe that in a few months we will see a revival of the corona narrative, and also the people who represent the institutions, who represent the ideology that is behind the corona crisis, will try to promote the narrative again in a few months, I think. And I really believe that the masses will go along with the narrative again.
Or at least that 30 to 40%, right? That will still stick.
Yes, at least those. But yes.
If that's the way technological and atomistic societies are going to fall prey to, how come we didn't see this level of mass formation in like the 80s and 90s in America. I don't know, you know, how things were in your country at those times, but it felt like things were not as politicized, things were not as aggressive, people were more happy. You know, obviously there were problems going on, but it just felt like the world wasn't so, I mean, America didn't feel as totalizing politically. So why was that not happening back then when we had communication technology, we had materialistic philosophy, we had, you know, it just
Yes.
wasn't as bad because it wasn't internet yet and there wasn't text and all that?
No, and the levels of anxiety were much lower. And just before the corona crisis, for instance, 1 out of 5 of the people worldwide were diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. Can you imagine that?
Mm-hmm.
In a small country such as Belgium, 300 million doses of antidepressants were used each year in a population of 11 million people.
Mm-hmm.
So the level of sick leave due to physical disorders, psychological disorders, had never been as high as in the year just before the corona crisis. Just before the corona crisis, the society was really ready for a mass formation. It was really ready. Extremely high levels of social isolation, extremely high levels of people who considered their jobs and their lives as meaningless, extremely high levels of anxiety, frustration, and aggression. The number of aggressive word use on the internet tripled in 5 years.
So it's much more satisfying to have an object for explaining that anxiety rather than to have it free floating, right?
Oh yes, of course, of course. That's exactly why people develop symptoms such as phobias and compulsive thoughts and so on. It always happens in the following way. First, the people feels a little bit uneasy, the people feels a certain psychological discomfort, the people feels a certain level of free-floating anxiety, and then suddenly, without him knowing it, all this free-floating anxiety connects in a completely irrational way to a snake or a spider or something, and the person suddenly is confronted with a kind of anxiety that he cannot explain. And very often he knows rationally that the spider cannot hurt him or that she cannot do anything really seriously bad to him, but still he will be anxious when he sees the spider. That's just because the person knows that it is irrational to be anxious, but his psychological system will continue to connect the anxiety to this object because it offers him a serious psychological advantage. From then on, he can control his anxiety just by avoiding spiders. And in exactly the same way, that's also the reason, but then at the collective level, why people become sensitive for mass formation. They are confronted with an uncontrollable...
Kind of like a placebo effect, you know, it kind of helps assuage some of their free-floating anxieties by saying, well, as long as you avoid coronavirus with these rituals, it's like a pacifier for some of the free-floating anxieties about disconnected from your neighbor, disconnected from your family, disconnected from your community, disconnected from your earth, disconnected from your environment, disconnected from your health and your body's wellness, disconnected from a meaningful job. All those disconnected feelings, you kind of take a placebo effect and put the mask on, take the vaccine, and it makes you feel like, well, I'm managing the source of these anxieties by staving off this particular disease. So it's like it is a kind of temporary catharsis, but like you said, it doesn't satisfy, does it? Yeah.
No, it's a symptomatic catharsis, of course, because it creates even more of the problem it tries to solve. That's symptomatic about it. That's always the case with symptoms.
Just like a drug, you take a drug to mask symptoms and it causes more underlying problems.
And it causes them more, and then you have to take a higher dose of
more
the drug.
Medication.
Yeah, but it's all exactly the same mechanism. Yes.
Well, we've had what a really fascinating conversation we've had together. I've really learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to people reading your book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. It's published by Chelsea Green Publishing, coming out in June 2022. So go ahead and pre-order if you're excited to learn more about why the world is acting the way it is. And what do you hope to accomplish with this book? What do you want to achieve as success here?
I really hope that people become aware of the mechanism of mass formation and much more, that they become aware of the connection between rationalist, mechanist, materialist thinking, worldview, and mass formation and totalitarianism, and then start to see that that we need to create a new view on man and the world in which free speech and something like truth is considered crucial for humanity and for society. That's what I hope, that my book might contribute to understanding how our rationalist ideology actually creates loneliness, creates mass formation, and then creates totalitarianism, and that the only way to avoid this is to start to accept and to really feel and understand that our rational thinking is limited, and that we have to move on to a different way of knowing the world around us, reconnecting with nature and with other people, practicing the art of good speech, of truth speech. That's what I hope.
Very good. Professor Matthias Desmet, thank you for your time, sir.
You're welcome. It was nice to talk to you, David. I also learned a lot, so it's very nice.